Well, good morning. Welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. So glad to have you with us. Earlier this month, someone in our Facebook group, Cooking from Scratch on Debbie's Back Porch, was looking for a traditional Russian recipe. And while I don't think we ever got the recipe she was looking for exactly, it reminded me of this one, so I thought I would make it for you. This is Russian mushroom and potato soup, and I find there are dozens of versions of this all over the interwebs. But this is how I remember it, and I certainly don't claim it as an original recipe. I do claim that my version is pretty darn tasty. Let me show you how I did it. I'll start by going over the ingredients, and as always, I will list the ingredients in the info section. These are mushrooms, and I canned them. The recipe calls for fresh, but I canned these, and I'm going to use them. That's some fresh dill and some dried dill. You need them both. I have here about 2 pounds of potatoes and one very large carrot that I found in my garden this week, hiding. I tend to stick carrot seeds in any empty spot, and then I find them. This is a leek. I'm going to use 1 leek and 1 medium onion. You can use 2 leeks or all onion. And then there is some chicken broth. And there will be just a few more ingredients, and I'll put them in the list. So let me talk a little bit about leeks. This one looks a little beat up. My refrigerator sometimes gets a little bit too cold in spots, and this one got a little bit too cold. Leeks are dirty. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know any other way to say it. You have to be careful when you're using leeks, because the way that it's made with these big long leaves, dirt can get into the part where it's loose, and that's the green part. And I always cut the whole green part off and use the white part that is tight and compact, and then wash it really well. If you're not familiar with using leeks, these are not just big old green onions. They taste a little different. You cut them and use them a little differently. And I'm going to take this opportunity to show you my Christmas present. My youngest son got this for me. It's a 7-cup KitchenAid food processor, and I'm going to use it to slice up this leek. It's going to go so fast you almost won't see it. He got this for me because I've been having some trouble with my hands and with chopping and dicing. I have a nice big food processor, but he got me this little one that will fit on my countertop and not take up too much room. And I have to say, this little thing is a game changer. So I've washed and peeled this big old carrot, and it's huge. This was Baker Creek Chantenay carrots, and they're huge. I need to cut that one down a little bit, I think. So down through the food processor, we're slicing this up too. It's going to take more than one run through. Let me show you this little thing. See how it opens? It doesn't twist, and that makes it easier to use for me. And the lid just comes right off and on easily too. So this is KitchenAid 7-cup food processor. And if you have a nice son or daughter, perhaps it'll get you one too. So this made quick work. I'm going to meet you at the stove. So I have both a 5-quart enamel Dutch oven, and over here I have a skillet, and I'll show you what I'm going to do with both of those. And I'll start with a couple of ingredients that I didn't list. I have a stick of butter, 1/2 cup. I'm going to split it between my Dutch oven and my skillet over here and let it melt slowly. And I'm also going to add some cooking oil. Olive oil works fine for this. I have grapeseed oil, and I'm going to add about 2 tablespoons. See how I estimated that? It's not critical how much, because you'll have to add some more as this cooks. Just don't put too much, just a little bit. And over in this skillet here, I have the other half of the butter. Now the reason I have two pans is I'm going to brown the mushrooms in the skillet as I make the soup in the big pot over here. Now the recipe calls for 1 pound of fresh mushrooms, but back during the summer, Aldi's had mushrooms on sale for $1 a box, and I canned a whole flat of mushrooms, and we're going to use them now. I'm not going to go to the store to buy mushrooms at a much higher price. Because life in a real kitchen, like your kitchen or my kitchen, sometimes calls for substitutions. So I have both of these pans on a low to medium low heat because I don't want to burn that butter. I'll be right back. So into the butter and oil, I'm going to put the sliced leeks, onion, and carrot. I didn't show you that I put that medium onion. I sliced it in here too. Now again, you can use 2 medium onions, 1 large onion, 2 leeks. You can use a bunch of green onions, any of those things. But I'm going to tell you, leeks really do taste a little bit different than onions, and I recommend you use leeks. I'm adding a little salt on top of this, about half a teaspoon. That helps the vegetables wilt. And I'm going to cook them on a low heat until the vegetables are soft and the onion and leek are translucent. And the time on that's going to vary depending on how thinly you sliced your vegetables. You want to slice them pretty thinly. Now I'm going to add a half teaspoonful of dried dill and let those cook together. You can use fresh dillweed. It's much stronger in flavor. And I'm going to add about a tablespoonful of chopped dillweed fresh at the very end, which is optional and is mostly for a garnish. And you know what? I didn't put the onion in there. I'm putting it in now. I just looked over on my counter and realized I hadn't put it into the food processor, so I'm chopping it up and adding it now. So I opened up my mushrooms and I drained the liquid into a cup. I'm going to use that, and I'm browning those over here just a little bit separately. Now I'm going to be honest, I have no idea why this recipe calls for the mushrooms to be browned separately, but every recipe I've ever seen on this does the mushrooms separately, so I'm going to do it that way too. So this is a 12-ounce jar of mushrooms. The recipe calls for a pound of mushrooms, fresh. So those quantities are going to be comparable. By the time you cook the fresh mushrooms, they're going to lose some liquid and they'll be smaller. So my guess is this would be marginally better if you use the fresh, but I canned these from fresh mushrooms and I'm going to use them, and they're mighty good. And let me tell you why I'm going into such detail about the substitution. Every time I make a video from something that's traditional and I make any kind of a substitution, I get inundated by people, usually fairly nasty, telling me how I don't know what I'm doing, and if I'm not going to make it by the original recipe, then I ought not to be making a video at all. And my answer to that is always that in real kitchens throughout history, people didn't go hungry just because they didn't have the exact right recipe for what we now think of as traditional recipes. Feeding a family does not mean making special trips to the store for expensive ingredients. Feeding a family well means making something scrumptious out of what you have on hand, which is how most of these traditional recipes were developed to begin with. So getting down off my soapbox now, and going to finish this soup. So back to our vegetables. I've been letting these just sort of sit and simmer for about 10 minutes. I did have to add 2 more tablespoons full of oil because they got a little dry as they were sitting here simmering. And I'm going to add the little bit of liquid that was in the canned mushrooms just to make sure I get all that flavor in there. And then I'm going to add a quart of chicken broth. And you know, I've never tried this with beef broth, but I think it would be good. And we're going to use a total of 6 cups, quart and a half, of the chicken broth. But right now I'm only putting the 1 quart, the 4 cups, into the soup pot. And then the 2 pounds of potatoes. Now I slice these potatoes very, very thinly. Now, warning, warning, take note here. I failed to capture on camera that at this point I added 2 bay leaves because they were small. 1 regular size one is enough. I'm going back to the counter for the next step. So what I've done here is a 1/4 cup of flour and the remaining 2 cups of chicken broth, and I'm making a slurry, and I just found that the immersion blender is the right tool for making a slurry so that I don't have any lumps of flour. Here's a funny little side note. My grandson Eli is home on leave, and he just discovered using an immersion blender for his protein shakes. So guess what his Christmas present was? So back to our soup, and while I failed to show you putting in the bay leaf, I'm going to show you taking it out. There's 2 in here. I found 1. I may have to wait a little bit to find the other one. I don't want to break it up in there. So now we're going to thicken our soup, and I'll take the bay leaf out when I find it. And there we go. So I got both the bay leaves out. And now we're going to thicken the soup. With a whisk, I just start stirring, and I pour in that slurry that we just made over on the counter. And see how much easier that is than beating it with a fork or a small whisk to dissolve the flour. So I'm just going to stir it all the way through, make sure it's incorporated in, and this is going to thicken more as it cooks. And don't worry about breaking up those thin potatoes. This is soup. That'll just make it thicker. And now I'm going to put the mushrooms in. Quick note here, if you are using fresh mushrooms, you want to make sure you get all of the juice that cooked out of them moved over to your soup. I did that when I drained the jar and put that little bit of mushroom juice into the soup. And now we'll just stir the mushrooms in, and we're just about done. Just a couple more steps. First, I'm going to let this simmer for about 15 minutes and thicken up. Get rid of any of the sort of pasty taste from the flour. Then I'm going to add some freshly ground black pepper. See how this is thickened up? This is a nice, rich soup. But we're not quite done yet. We have to taste it for salt. So let me stir it around and get some of that soupy part and give it a little taste for salt. Now, if you'll remember, I've only put a half teaspoonful of salt in this whole pot, but you had some salt in the mushrooms and you had some salt in the broth, and so, you know, this is fine. I don't need a bit more salt. And you can see that this is a really rich, creamy looking soup just as it is, but now we're going to add a cup of heavy cream. I turned the temp down on this before I added the cream, by the way. You want to wait until the very end to do this, and I will stir it in really well. Leave the heat on medium-low and let it come back up to a simmer before we serve it. And I just want you to look at this creaminess that we've got here. It's back up to just a simmer, and we're going to add some chopped dillweed to the top. It'll be a garnish. You can do it per bowl if you want to. Just add a little dillweed to the bowl. But my grandson and I are serving ourselves from the pot tonight, so I just put it right in the pot. Now I want you to look at that. To me, potato soup is a comfort food, and I don't eat it often because of the high carbs. So when I do, I want it to be special. And this, my friends, is special. And speaking of carbs, by the way, you can make your potato soup half potato, half cauliflower, different flavor, same yummy creaminess, and cut the carbs in half. So next time you want to do a change up on a family favorite, I hope you try this recipe, and I hope you love it as much as I do. And I hope to see you again tomorrow on Debbie's Back Porch.